here and speak about something, of course, near and dear to my heart, that is education and primarily literacy development. And I'd like to talk a little bit, kind of complicate the conversation about literacy itself and give you, next after that, an example of some non-traditional literacies, just to complicate this construct, this whole idea of what is literacy. As we know, I'm Coady from the College of Education. I work in second language education, and I work with immigrant and migrant families locally here, and run a project some of you might know called, I have run and worked in and out of a project called Literacy Day Gainesville, Family Books Project, that works with immigrant families in this area in North Florida. I'd like to just talk a little bit at first about the Millennium Goals, just by way of following up and introducing what the Millennium Goals are and what they're telling us that we need to do by 2015. I like this, literacy for peace, you know, if you notice this picture of a dove, the symbol of a dove, and I think that's telling in part about what I'm going to talk about, and that is that we learn to read symbols and graphics and so on as part of our kind of computer literacy as a type of literacy that often gets overlooked when we talk about literacy. I want to focus on the Millennium Development Goal, the target 2A, appropriately ensure that all boys and girls complete a full course of primary education. And underneath that goal, if you look at the third point, 2.3 here, you see that the target is for a 100% literacy rate of 15 to 24-year-olds, men and women. So this 15 to 24-year-old category, according to the United Nations, is what they refer to as their youths. They say youths, they put S. We say youth, they say youths, but 15 to 24-year-old men and women to achieve literacy in that particular age group. I was looking at some of the statistics from the United Nations on their fact sheet on literacy, and I started to say, this is very interesting. I wonder if our people here know about this. In 2008, 796 million adults worldwide, ages 15 and older, so that's considered the youth to adult population, could not read and write. That's a big number. 64% of those were female. And then more than half of them lived in Southern Asia and a significant portion in sub-Saharan Africa. So that is similar, those data are similar to the group of youth, those 15 to 24-year-olds, that is the target population for the Millennium Goals. And you can see that it's specifically to this region, these two regions of the world, that we have issues of literacy and the goal of literacy development for this population. So I thought I'd stop for a second here and say, okay, well, literacy is a goal, but what is literacy? Because from our perspective in education, when we think about literacy, we don't always think about literacy as strictly interacting with text, reading and writing, although I'm suspecting from the work here that this is how literacy is measured. So I pose the question, what is literacy? And based on the United Nations goals, it includes a basic ability to read and write, and that is to encode, to take language and to put it into some kind of written form, and to decode, to be able to decipher those codes, that symbols, sometimes letters, that are put together in our language, in English, to form words, and that we use to represent, that have meaning behind them. So we think about literacy typically measured as the ability to read and write, but it's not always that. In fact, in 1996, which is kind of probably a while ago now, there was a group of scholars that was brought together called the New London Group. They met in New London, New Hampshire. And so they developed this idea called multiple literacies. And so I want to introduce that to you today, this notion of multiple literacies, because 21st century literacies, and especially literacies we see that come from non-traditional populations, and I suspect some of the populations that are considered non-literate by these data actually have different kinds of literacies. So what I'm presenting to you next in these next few slides is a case study of a family that used non-traditional literacies. And so I want to complicate this notion just a little bit, that literacy might not be the way we measure it, just the ability to interact with text, reading and writing text. So anyway, I went on Google and I thought, well, okay, I wonder what Google has to say about literacy. Google knows an awful lot more than I'll ever know. So I looked up Google and I just put in the word literacy, and there were more than 92 million references in 0.13 seconds. And I thought, this is a complex topic. This is not something very simple. So I mentioned the New London Group. 21st century literacies for the New London Group, I figure, more situated, in fact. The context, I refer to two things: the context of diverse populations, culturally, linguistically diverse peoples, in a globalized society that have multiple kinds of cultures and interrelate plurality of texts that circulate among people. They also know that there's a variety of text, and text can be oral, so a variety of text forms that are associated with information and multimedia technologies. So literacy for this century is not just interacting with simple book kind of materials. Judith Langer, who's a scholar in education, said it like this, and I like her definition: literacy can be viewed in a broader and educationally more productive way as the ability to think and reason like a literate person within a particular society. So I think that we start trying to introduce Western notions of literacy and measure those. I think we're missing a whole bunch of resources about what literacy is, especially when we think about indigenous populations. Here's an example. I'll try to be quick for you. And she goes on to say, literacy, culturally appropriate ways of thinking. To the next slide here. Okay, in my work with immigrant families, I say immigrant because families in this community are both migrant. That means they work in agricultural industries and they're highly mobile. They move. They know an awful lot about harvesting and seasons and so on, things like that. And they're also frequently immigrant families that are not, children are not originally or may be born in the United States, but the parents are not. They're immigrant families in the United States. I did a little study. It was actually more than a little study. It was a 5-family study that lasted about 1 year with immigrant and migrant families in our local community outside of Gainesville, Florida. And I was interested in their literacy practices and their language uses. And in particular literacy, what kinds of literacies do they use? Why did I want to know that? Well, I wanted to know because when teachers work with children in schools, they also have goals they need to set in terms of reading and writing ability. They need to pass the 3rd grade FCAT, and that means interacting with academic kinds of language and text. And so we have a purpose, they have a purpose for those kind of goals to be set. And I thought, well, I know that immigrant families don't always have the kinds of literacy that teachers expect them to have in their home. So I was curious, what's happening in the home that families bring with them as resources that we can use and tap into in education to help children be successful. What I found was that these literacy practices among these 5 families were non-traditional, and they were not necessarily reading and writing. I'm going to just show you in a couple slides how that was the case. Here's one family that's an immigrant family. They were also migrant. They worked in mostly plants, palm industries, and plant nurseries that we have outside of Gainesville, Florida. I'll call them Senor and Senora Garcia. They are, that's not their name. They were from Mexico, the parents. They're in the middle of the picture here. And from the region of Hidalgo, Mexico. The parents' education was primaria, which is through 6th grade for both of the parents. Their first language spoken as children in the home was Coaty, an indigenous language spoken in the Hidalgo region of Mexico. Their second language, which they could read and write, was Spanish. And their third language was English, although the parents had low English ability levels if we looked at the way they used English, the context in which they used it. What I found very clearly in this particular family's home was that the literacy practices that they invoked were not practices that consisted of interacting with text, reading and writing. The practices, in fact, included cooking and measurement, especially the mom with the girls, recipes handed down orally to daughters. The mother used both Spanish and Otomi to pass these down. These were kinds of literacy activities we refer to as oracy and numeracy in education. There was a prized religious book that was a translated Bible in Otomi that the parents could decode very little in the language, but they read it and they spoke that language in the home. The children, however, attended church services and they could decode Spanish. They could understand Otomi. They wouldn't speak it. They could decode Spanish and speak Spanish, but their literacy, the text interaction they had in Spanish was limited to the church context. So they went to religious services in Spanish. And finally, the symbols that they used were very limited in terms of interacting with traditional kinds of resources like books. But the children loved picture books. They could decode pictures very well and tell stories from them. Computer sources that required understanding symbols and so on, like doves that represent representations of peace. And they could read calendars and things like that.